would hazard to guess that neither of our two experts speaking today could have foreseen the connection between olfaction and today's pandemic. But time and time again, we benefit hugely from high quality basic research. The two leading neuroscientists in conversation this afternoon are Gilad Barnea and Alex Fleischmann. Gilad Barnea and his colleagues study how the brain processes signals that contain information about odors from the nose, the point of detection, to the brain, the point of perception. Gilad Barnea's lab is also developing genetic tools to light up the neural pathways that transfer and encode odor signals. Alex Fleischmann and his lab also study how neural circuits generate sensory perception, for example, smell, relevant today, with more emphasis on how perceptions and behaviors are encoded by the neural networks in the brain. And finally, Chris Moore, Associate Director of the Carney Institute, is the moderator for today's discussion. So Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to get the conversation rolling. Chris Moore.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks to everyone who is listening, and most importantly to Alex and Gilad for generously joining us to share their expertise. So olfaction has always been a really important area of research within the Carney Institute. And it's taken on a new global significance because some COVID-19 patients, a fairly high fraction, lose the ability to smell early in the disease. So to maybe get us oriented, could you start by giving us just a quick snapshot? Like, how does our nose make odors into perceptions?
Sure. So I'll take that, and I have a few slides that I'll share to illustrate what we are talking about. So let me just do that. So this is an illustration of the olfactory circuit by Ramon Cajal, one of the giants of neuroscience. In some ways, the father of a lot of neuroscience, of modern neuroscience. This is from the late 19th century. And I just do a quick survey of the anatomy here. So this area here is the olfactory epithelium in the nose. So these neurons, these are bipolar neurons that have protrusion of cilia into the lumen of the nose here, where the air travels, and chemicals in the air bind receptors that are located on these cilia. This is obviously something that Ramon Cajal didn't know, but he inferred. The neurons, these neurons send a long axon across this bone here, which is the bottom of the skull, called the cribriform plate, to the olfactory bulb, the first area of the brain that involves in olfactory information processing. The olfactory bulb has structures that are called glomeruli, where multiple neurons from the nose converge and make synapses with these projection neurons. These are called mitral cells. Here, there are other class called tufted cells. And these projection neurons, in turn, send their axons to the olfactory cortex, to the amygdala, to other higher brain areas. There is a lot more that is happening here. And this, obviously, I'm kind of just doing the forward motion here without all the computation and changes that occur within each area here. It's remarkable how much, every time I look at this slide, I get excited, and by how much this giant Ramon Cajal could do just by anatomical staining, because the only one place where he was wrong, and he was not even wrong, he just didn't know, is that, as you can see here, he has the neurons converge on one glomerulus, and this neuron and its neighbors will converge here, and so on. And that's the only tiny little mistake that he has, because the neurons that converge on the glomerulus are not, in fact, clustered together, but they are scattered within the epithelium, and what gives them their identity is the olfactory receptor gene that they express. But I cannot complain about Ramon Cajal because the concept of gene was not known then. So he was really right in many ways. So it took another 100 years until Richard Axel and Linda Bach. Richard is the mentor of both Alex and me. We both did a postdoctoral fellowship with him, and Linda Bach was his postdoctoral fellow at that time, 20 years, well, 30 years ago. And in 1991, they had a seminal paper in which they identified the receptor, the olfactory receptor genes, and that's kind of the next huge introduction into modern olfaction or modern olfactory research. And they identified a huge family of genes, about 1,000 genes. Each one of these encodes a different receptor. They later showed that their groups showed that each neuron in the olfactory epithelium expresses only one of these receptors, and all the neurons that express the same receptor converge on the glomerulus. So this is actually shown here from a paper by Peter Mombarts, then a postdoctoral fellow in Richard Axel's lab. And what Peter did here, this is a mouse. This is the olfactory epithelium here. I hope you can see the cursor. And this is the cribriform plate, the base of the skull. This is the olfactory bulb. And Peter did label one population of neurons that expresses one receptor to show the projections of these neurons. And you can see very nicely what Ramon Cajal saw before, that the neurons that express the same receptor converge on this one glomerulus in the bulb. So there are 1,000 populations of neurons, each one of which expresses only one receptor, and they converge on 1,000 different glomeruli in the bulb. So now let's say a word or two about the number of odors and the number of receptors. So we have 1,000 receptor genes, but we are capable of identifying way more than 1,000 odors. The error in the estimation goes on over a range of a million folds. So there are minimalists who are saying hundreds of thousands of odors. Maximalists are saying about 1 trillion odors. Somewhere in between hundreds of thousands and 1 trillion, that's the number of odors that we can identify. And all of this is accomplished by 1,000 receptors. 1,000 receptors to so many odors, it means that one receptor can bind multiple odors, and each odor can bind multiple receptors, and there is a combinatorial code that is then processed by the brain. Now, all of this will become relevant to our conversation, because when we talk about loss of the sense of smell, it can happen in this stage of the nose, in this stage of the olfactory bulb, or in higher brain areas that receive input from the olfactory bulb. Just before I stop within this scholarly introduction, I want to show you another slide, the final slide that I want to show, which is a section through the olfactory epithelium. And it's actually, this is a slide from a paper that of my work. And what we did here is we stained the particular specific olfactory receptor that is called MOR28 with antibodies that we generated to this receptor. So here you can see, again, this is the lumen, and this is where the odor molecules travel. In topic of our conversation today, that's also where potentially the virus will travel. And then these are the olfactory sensory neurons. These are the dendrites with this cilia that Ramon Cajal showed you before. And this is the beginning of where their axon is going. The epithelium is continuously regenerating. And the area here is where the stem cells are residing. here are the immature olfactory neurons, and this layer is where the olfactory receptor expressing neurons are located. All of these are also receptor neurons, but they are expressing other receptors, so they are not detected. The final cell that will come up in our conversation today is here, and these are support cells that are called sustentacular cells. They are between the olfactory receptor neurons. They are residing there in the very apical part of the epithelium, and they also face the outside, the lumen. Last thing I will say is that the regeneration here, so this is maybe the only place in the body where you have a neuron that is really contacting the external world, and this is very harsh. So the neurons die routinely and are replaced by the stem cells that are residing here. So I think this is enough for introduction.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you very much. So one question that comes up a lot in literature and just in personal experience, olfaction seems to form the most vivid memories. It's almost like there's a particular connection between those two. So, I mean, just before getting into the COVID, going into sort of a more brain-centric aspect of this, why is that? Why is it that olfaction does such a good job of like imprinting itself on us for tens of years?
Great question. I'll take this one. I don't think we have one straightforward answer. One thing that comes up, and I think that's part of what you pointed out, is that olfaction evokes strong emotional memory components, and that's something we can explain based on the anatomy of cortical nerve circuits for olfaction. So olfaction is a primal sense. It's simpler in its organization compared to vision, hearing, and touch, and very tightly and directly connects to the limbic system, to brain systems that encode emotional aspects of behavior, such as the amygdala or the ventral hippocampus. And so unlike vision, hearing, or touch, odor stimuli are not processed with these extensive corticothalamic pathways and directly linked to, let's say, the amygdala and hippocampal regions where memories and emotional memories in particular are thought to be stored. So in that sense, the anatomy can guide us and give us some explanation as to why the olfactory system has this tight link to emotional memories. A second idea, perhaps more speculative explanation, is that the majority of smells, I would argue, don't necessarily carry inherent meaning. So they generate, or the meaning is primarily generated through learning and experience. So you could argue that the smell of a glass of red wine is not something that we make sense of unless we associate it with a nice meal or a positive social context or something like that. And so the fact that we interpret and give meaning to smells through learning and experience may also be a reason why they evoke such strong memories.
Thanks, that's great. All right, so to dive into our topic here, using the formal trade name for the virus, SARS-CoV-2, why is this such a common? Do we know why it's such a common symptom now for people to lose their sense of smell? I've also heard loss of sense of taste as a big outcome. Do we know why that happens?
So why is not a question that I like to answer, but I'll take it as how. Any student who took my course knows that this is how we kick off. So I have to stay true to myself. First of all, you know, we are in it, so it looks to us as if we have been in it for ages, especially since we are scattered in our own shelters. But actually this virus has been around only for a very short time. And it's incredible how fast things are moving scientifically. And, you know, when Alex and I wrote this, perspective piece, we still had to say that the olfactory symptoms are anecdotal. The information is anecdotal. And yesterday or 2 days ago, the CDC issued a new list of symptoms, and these symptoms are part of the bona fide symptoms. So it's not anecdotal anymore. And the question is how the virus does it? How does the infection by the virus causes the loss of sense of smell and taste? And the other question, I guess, is what comes later. You know, once people recover, do they regain the sense of smell? It's extremely, this question, I don't know if it's well known, but it's also an extremely important question because the loss of sense of smell, one, is dangerous because people can not smell the smoke in the gas in the stove, not when it's leaking, or more casually eat something that is very bad. Loss of smell is associated with anhedonia, with depression even. So gaining it is also very important. I think less is known there. Now, how does the virus impact the sense of smell? So there are two main possibilities, and each one of them may be divided. And this is why I went through the introduction slides. So one is a direct effect, or let's say a nose effect. If the virus, let's say, kills the olfactory sensory neurons, the result will be loss of ability to smell. Another alternative is that the virus does something higher in the brain, either in the olfactory bulb or higher in the brain. So these are the two big possibilities. And then in each one of them, it kind of, there are nuances, and I want to discuss one of them. So let's talk about the olfactory epithelium. The virus could theoretically infect the olfactory sensory neurons directly. And if it did that and killed them, you would get what we are describing, the loss of sense of smell. Alternatively, the virus could either affect the olfactory sensory neurons indirectly by infecting other neurons in the epithelium. And in fact, there is a paper from a manuscript from a colleague of Alex and mine, which is in bioRxiv at the moment. So it's probably in review. And this paper, they were very smart in what they did. They were looking for the receptor for the virus that is called ACE2 and a protease that is also involved in the infection. And they said, let's look at the populations of neurons in the olfactory epithelium and see which one of them expresses these genes, because these genes...
Wait, Gilad, let me ask a clarifying question here. You said the receptor for the virus is ACE2. So can you unpack that for a second? Like, what does it mean to have a receptor for the virus? Or, I mean, what do you mean by that?
So when the virus infects, it has to attach the cells and get internalized into the cells. And the cellular protein to which the virus attach is a cellular receptor called ACE2. And there is also a protease, that cellular protease, you know, viruses, they hijack whatever is there on the cell surface and in the cell nucleus, and they hijack the cell in general, and they do what they need to do. So in order to enter the cells, the virus binds to this protein ACE2, and it's later on, there is a cleavage effect by a cellular protease. And so the group of our colleague Bob Data at Harvard Medical School, they say, okay, let's look at the RNA sequence information or expression data sets of different populations of neurons in the olfactory epithelium, and we'll see which one of them expresses the cellular proteins that the virus needs in order to infect the cells. So I think it's a very nice idea, and it panned out. So the first thing that is clear is that the olfactory sensory neurons themselves do not express these proteins. So the virus is most likely, the virus doesn't infect directly the olfactory sensory neuron. However, they found that both the stem cells and the support cells, these sustentacular cells that I showed that are also facing the lumen, they express these proteins in levels similar to the levels that the cells lining the lower respiratory system, you know, the epithelium of the nose that is not involved in smelling, as well as the lining of the lung, in similar levels. There are some things that are not clear because the expression is patchy. It's not that everything is, all of these cells express these receptors. So their model is that maybe the unhealthy epithelium, because of the infection of the support cells, then leads to death of the sensory neurons. And they show that they refer to a paper in rat where something like this happened. Now, so this is one possibility. Another possibility, and this is attractive because you have some data for it. Another possibility in the epithelium is that the inflammation, the massive inflammation that this virus generates, impacts the sensory neurons indirectly, and perhaps even impact gene expression in the sensory neuron. What if the inflammation somehow alters the ability of the neuron to express the receptor? That would be very detrimental to the cell. Either way, the fact that the receptor itself does not, the olfactory sensory neuron itself does not express the proteins needed for viral entry is very meaningful, I think. And if you allow us to speculate a little bit, as I showed you before, the olfactory sensory neuron starts from the outside of the body, in the lumen of the brain, of the nose, and it sends its axon into the brain. So you have one cell that one end of it is outside and the other end of it is in the brain. There is no other neuron like this, which is why the olfactory neurons have, for a long time, were mentioned or suspected as an entry way to the brain. So in the case of the virus, what if the virus infected the olfactory sensory neuron, and then in the axon side, it's already in the brain? So that at least is not the case, most likely based on this data, because the olfactory receptor neuron cannot be itself infected, most likely. Again, I mean, sometimes viruses have another receptor or co-receptor or other things that may come up. The last thing I wanted to say about it is that I mentioned before that one could affect, so this is how it most likely, the peripheral olfactory system is affected by the virus, but there is also a potential for infection, again, either direct infection of the brain somehow, because, or you know, maybe part of the inflammatory effect of the blood-brain barrier. Maybe the blood-brain barrier is weakened and the virus can enter the brain. I mean, there is anecdotal information about brain effects of infection. So that's another possibility, right? That the virus affects the sense of smell higher up in the brain and not only in the nose. So I guess that's a long answer, but I hope that's what I kind of think about it.
That's great. Diane, did you have a question?
Yeah, you know, I was maybe, I don't know if Alex can take this, but if neurons are dying, if the olfactory neurons are dying, can we, do we know how quickly the sense of smell returns after COVID-19 infection? And does that give a clue about what might be going wrong? I mean, often, you know, in science, we're looking at how quickly does something occur, but also how quickly does normality return? So are there any clues there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. If we knew, if we had more data, I think that would tell us a lot about the mechanism of how we lose our sense of smell. From what I know, and that's certainly not the complete picture, we don't have this data in a comprehensive way yet. The one possibility is, so the olfactory sensory neurons regenerate through proliferation and differentiation of stem cells in the olfactory epithelium, which Gilad introduced at the beginning. And in model systems, and to the extent that it's known in humans, that takes a couple of weeks for mature sensory neurons to emerge and then reconnect to the brain centers to reestablish this pathway for sensory detection and processing. So that would be the time frame you would expect to see if neurons were killed and then being regenerated from stem cells. Now, the receptor for the virus, as Gilad mentioned, is expressed in support cells, but may also be expressed in the stem cells. And so there is a possibility that stem cells themselves may be compromised due to viral infection. And so I think we'll just have to see what the dynamics are and how the sense of smell comes back in the case of COVID-19.
So one question is, Gilad mentioned that the CDC has now officially listed it as a formal symptom or diagnostic, in the sense of one of the things that happens to you when you get COVID-19, the disease. Could we use this as a diagnostic? Is there a way to like check on your sense of smell? I think something we're all probably wondering all the time is, have we been exposed to it?
Right. So I think absolutely, yes. I think that's a great option, and I think, and that's also one that we see a lot of activity in that area. And I want to sort of add to Gilad's comment about how quickly things evolve. It's amazing. I mean, we've been seeing smell tests over the past couple of years here and there, and now boom, there's a lot of activity on that front. The obvious advantages are that they're cheap and quick. They can be performed at home or at the clinic. They can be performed over extended periods of time. And they could help to identify people at risk. So clearly, olfactory deficits are a very prominent symptom in this disease, but it's not a final diagnosis. It could definitely help to identify people at risk and identify people who should be prioritized to get additional testing. And I think one interesting question is that there is heterogeneity. So some people have very prominent olfactory deficits, often in the absence of other symptoms. I should mention that these olfactory deficits are not usually, don't go hand in hand with a stuffy nose or congestion, which would be a trivial explanation, but they happen in some people overnight, that they completely lose their sense of smell despite the fact that they breathe normally. So I think it's a very interesting potential test that I would expect to gain some prominence in the coming weeks. And I just pulled up two websites. I can quickly share them with you. Two examples from colleagues of ours that have come up with these tests. So I'll put them on the screen. So, oops, let me move that. So here's a test. It's called the smell tracker from Noam Sobel, a colleague of ours at the Fleischmann Institute in Israel. And what's interesting here is that it's a very simple test you can do at home. So basically you're taking a bunch of household items. So I picked, as order number 1, I picked honey. There's a extensive list of things you can pick in your kitchen primarily, and it covers sort of a range of cultures and contexts. And then you go through, you rank them as intensity and pleasantness, and there's a couple other questions, and you go through that, and it gives you a score basically, and you can do that every day, and it clearly has the capability of highlighting potential deficit in olfaction that may happen at a certain point in time. A second, and again, the advantage here is that you can pick things to smell at home and follow your sense or your capability to detect and discriminate them using this online format. Another option, okay, is a test that just came out, put together by colleagues of ours at MGH, Harvard, and uses a sniff card. So it's called the COVID smell test, and that's the website. It comes with a card where you peel off a cover, and then you have a couple of orders, and you have an app with which you again identify and rank their intensity. And this is being rolled out in the clinic currently to support testing, and there's many more. I think, again, stop sharing my screen. I think it's a great complementary test to all the other tests that are obviously needed, but I think it's important. I just checked yesterday night the Rhode Island website, so they don't have it up specifically. They, as Gilad mentioned, also mentioned loss of smell as one of the symptoms. I haven't seen any sort of specific attempt to use olfaction as a screening tool.
Chris, can I add a couple of small things? So one is, I know from Rachel Hertz, who is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown. We communicated a few days ago, and she told me that she has developed, I think with somebody at Yale, a smell test also. So I'm sure there are many more. This one is close to home, it's here. So this is why I heard about it, but I'm sure that there are others who are also developing it. And something else that is related to your question is, today, in kind of preparation to this, I was looking and I saw that the University of California in San Diego had in their PR thing, they had something about a group there that did a survey of what's the relation between how well people are doing and the loss of smell. And in fact, their data, I didn't have a chance to read the original paper, I just read the press release, is their conclusion is that there is a correlation, an inverse correlation. So those who lose the sense of smell tend to do better, according to them. I mean, I don't know anything about it. And they had some explanations how maybe the virus infects you in a place where it doesn't kill you, and then you can promote immunity or something. But that may be still anecdotal, I don't know. I mean, this is a paper that they have, I guess, under review. But so it's relevant in many ways.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that has come up is that exactly what you're saying, the root of infection not only could have to do with the long-term outcome of the disease, depending where you get started, also could have a lot to do with the best route of treatment. So if a person was infected through their nasal epithelium, maybe it recommends a different kind of treatment. But if they're infected actually through their lungs or through the nasal passages, you know, these are the kinds of things that will come out. It really is amazing. You know, when you were mentioning overnight before, Alex, you know, the overnight surge in sort of the basic science, if you will, response to this, right? There are already all these tests out there. It goes to what Diane was saying about this kind of research is ongoing. You're never quite sure what's going to be the hyper relevant dimension. And that's, you know, a strong argument for it. It's also really striking, the idea of an overnight loss in the sense of smell, which I've also seen reports of that as well, that it's not like progressively the microenvironment gets worse and worse. And so suddenly, you know, over time, of course, if you make it unfriendly, maybe the neurons die. An overnight loss feels much more like the sustentacular cells. I just had to say that word at least once. And or the stem cells. I mean, could the infected cells be doing something more directly involved in smell, maybe? And so when they're impacted, that could, you know, this is, you know, pure speculation at this point, but it's interesting to think about ways the course of this disease could teach us something fundamental going in the other direction, from sort of the clinical to the basic, right?
If I can add a piece of speculation, one interesting point, if you were to lose subsets of your sensory neurons, you may, rather than lose your sense of smell, actually shift your perception of certain odors, right? And that does not appear to be happening from, again, I think it's somewhat anecdotal and not comprehensively studied. But what happens is more that you have an overall loss of smell, and that can be very pronounced or less pronounced, but it doesn't shift your sense of, you know, you don't misinterpret orders.
So we have a lot of really great questions coming in. I thought maybe if it's okay, Chris, I think I'll kick off with asking randomly one of them, and then maybe you can take a look through. They're fantastic, actually. So one of them is about the other coronaviruses, so like SARS, which also use ACE2 as a point of entry. But the person asking this question said, to their knowledge, that doesn't lead to an effect on smell and taste. So any thoughts?
I can briefly answer. When I looked through some of the papers, MERS and SARS and common flu have been documented to affect the sense of smell, perhaps not as prominently as we see here, but there are anecdotal reports that previous coronaviruses do affect the olfactory system.
Okay.
You know, the extent to which that shows up now more prominently as previously, I cannot answer.
Yeah.
I do think, and more generally speaking, I do think that looking through the literature, we learn a lot by looking at basic and clinical research that's been done with other coronaviruses, right? And that, for example, relates to what Gilad described, viral entry, and also some of the molecular and cellular mechanisms of how the virus gets us sick.
No, and typically those relatively small but quite significant differences across similar viruses can really give great insight, right, into mechanism of action. Yeah.
Can I broaden the question then? Well, so building on that, you know, one of the there's links between other kinds of diseases and loss of sense of smell. So there's a connection in Alzheimer's disease. I mean, if either of you can unpack that a little bit, and is that connected?
Well,
going beyond just other viruses too.
So Alzheimer's is only, it's interesting because actually there is actually older information about Parkinson's disease. So there is Parkinson's disease, there is Alzheimer's disease connection. So again, our colleague, Mark Albers, the one that, so the second test that Alex showed before is from the lab of Mark Albers. And he is studying Alzheimer's disease, and he is studying the olfactory system. And in fact, I think that this test he was developing for his Alzheimer's studies, and he wrote a nice review where he showed that the areas that are affected by in Alzheimer's disease, it's actually along the entire olfactory circuit. So you have, you know, I think that one of the holy grails in Alzheimer's disease is to identify the disease before the damage is done. So one of the major problems is that the scientific community and the medical community intervene when the horses are out of the barn already, and when you have the phenotype. And the idea is to get earlier and earlier in the prodromic stage to markers that can show you that you are on the way to develop Alzheimer's disease. And the olfactory system is one area that was suggested, and Mark is really following it very actively. And my hope is that when this test that he's doing will establish itself here, that will help also there. While COVID is an acute problem, Alzheimer's is a looming cloud that will continue to be a huge challenge. And again, there is also information about loss of smell or progressive loss of the sense of smell in Parkinson's disease. So if you can somehow contribute to the identification and diagnosis and treatment of these two major diseases, it's a huge thing. And that's another way to illustrate what Diane said in her introduction. Sometimes this very basic and apparently not related research is somehow manifest itself in just where you want it and you need it. So I think that there is a chance that olfaction will come into play in these neurodegenerative diseases also.
Right. So maybe we can continue on this theme again, running through some of the questions that are coming in. So here's one about, it's interesting. So a patient who recovers their sense of smell but if during the disease the virus has attacked the stem cells, does that mean that there's a depletion of stem cells for renewal? And do you think that might mean that those individuals, even though they've recovered sense of smell post-disease, will have some kind of premature aging of their smell sense?
I think that's the concern, and that's why I said in the beginning that I don't know if we know enough about people who had the disease, had the olfactory phenotypes or symptoms, and then recovered. If and when did they recover the sense of smell? Did they recover it completely? Did they recover it only partially? These are all extremely important questions, and I think that if this paper that is in bioRxiv that suggests that the receptors for the virus is on and the protease are on the stem cells also, that's a little bit disturbing for long-term recovery. So, but again, it may be sporadic. It may be that you need some stem cells and you are okay to recover. Just remember from the second slide that I showed, how the neurons that express the same receptor are scattered in the entire epithelium. So maybe there will be damage in one part and not in the other, and you can regain the sense of smell. We really don't know it, and I agree with what Chris said before, that the interplay between the clinical information and the basic science will be informative in both ways.
So, Chris, do you want to pick up? Okay. So there was an early question when you were, talking about I think from this questioner, it says OB-centric. I think olfactory bulb-centric would be my read of this. So the question is really about, do you expect microglia activation to be similar in patients who have COVID-19 disease as those who have lack of sense of smell for other reasons? And so I think the question is really getting at the immune response. Do you think that the immune response might be similar in patients and those with without the sense of smell for other reasons?
I think microglia are an amazing idea, and I see here that it's Cara Fulton, our student who is almost graduating, so hi Cara.
Right.
Hi
Cara.
And Cara should have an olfactory bulb-centric vision, so that's great. It's a very interesting idea, and I think that once you have, if you have the immune response, then if you have an involvement of the brain in the immune response, then microglia are the macrophages of the brain. So it's totally a good idea, a good hunch that they will be involved. And if they are involved, they can be involved in this. They can be involved in neurodegeneration. I mean, they can be involved in many bad things. So yeah, I think I don't think we have data. I mean, I see that she is referring a paper, but I haven't read the paper, so it will be interesting to see it, but it's a very intriguing idea.
One thing I also do want, again, looking through the questions, I do want to come back to, there are many other reasons for individuals losing their sense of smell. And so I think it probably is important for us to do a little bit of a reset here to indicate that this, for a subset of individuals, this occurs. It's not true for everybody. And if you lose your sense of smell, it does not mean that you have an infection from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and it does not mean that you have COVID-19 disease. It is one of a number of symptoms that are being identified to be associated with the disease, but nonetheless really extraordinarily interesting as well, not just for the public health implications, but also from the basic science perspective, which is what we're focusing on right now.
Sorry, Diane, and in fact, I think that in the new guidelines from the CDC, they clearly mentioned that you have to have a few of this list of things. So only loss of smell can obviously happen by chance now or because of other reason.
Right. So maybe I think, Chris, do you want to ask another question, or should we just move through additional questions from the audience? Just checking in with you. We have 10 minutes left, and we probably should wrap up, but maybe have one more question or one or two more questions.
Let's ask audience questions. I think we've got a good.
Yeah, so I think Gilad and Alex, you talked a little about the rather extreme vulnerability of neurons in the nose in terms of being exposed.
and a little about the potential, point of entry and route of entry potentially for some therapy. And would you like to speculate a little about that? And I think also perhaps reiterate how extraordinary the olfactory neurons are, given how exposed they are to the elements constantly. And I think it's actually pretty remarkable that we have such a great sense of being able to do odor detection, given that these poor neurons and olfactory neurons are constantly exposed to the elements. So I guess the question would be, what do you think about the potential for therapy through the nasal route, and also perhaps reiterating some of the things that you said earlier, but reinforcing how really extraordinary these olfactory neurons are?
So I don't know if we, I was kind of thinking about it a lot, but I don't know that one can use the olfactory route in order to heal this disease. I think that one could, I'll hijack this question a little bit. I think that one could potentially think about healing the olfactory symptoms, because if the mechanism is actually as a bystander for the immune response, then one could use modulator of the immune response that I'm sure that will be used also for the main problem with this disease in the lung, one of the main problems with the disease in the lung. So maybe one, if the olfactory symptoms are due to inflammation, one could modulate inflammation in the nose and improve olfactory capacity. I don't know about using the olfactory system as a route of entry. I mean, there are many suggestions that, studies that I read in the past, but I've never been very impressed with any of them about using the olfactory neurons as a route to be in the brain. I mean, with viruses, you can do it. So we know from the lab that there are viruses that to which the olfactory sensory neurons are very susceptible, and you can infect the nose with a virus and get them to express, and then you do see the axon in the bulb. Adenovirus, for example, does it. So not adeno-associated virus, adenovirus. And so one could devise some craziness in order to get into the brain, but I don't think that it's something immediate.
Maybe I can add one very speculative thought to that. If you think about the dynamics of infection, the nose may be an entry point and an early point where the disease manifests itself. And it's also been mentioned a lot as a reservoir for virus replication, and concentration of virus in the nasal epithelium appear to be very high. So one could, if one were able to target the disease early and target it locally in the nose, one could probably take the load off the lungs and central symptoms and reduce the load of virus early on if
right.
That's an option. And for that, I think nasal entry and nasal spray may actually be
right.
a possibility.
Yeah. There were a few questions about viral load as well.
So nose and throat doctors, I mean, that's been documented, have been exposed at high risk and likely because viral particle concentrations are very high in the nasal epithelium, respiratory epithelium.
So I think I'm going to throw one more question at you before I do Chris and I make some closing remarks. There are a number of questions about the demographics of loss of sense of smell with COVID-19 disease, and whether this may be linked to the potential sex differences in the ACE2 expression. Some note that that's higher in males than in females. So I know this is a complicated last question, but kind of a nice one that wraps a number of different observations together. And so maybe if either of you want to tackle this one, and then we'll make some closing remarks.
It's an easy one to answer because we really don't know the answer. I think that the studies that looked at the single cell expression and all that, they did, as far as I remember, they did not look at male versus female, and you know, so I don't know if this would account for that. And in fact, I looked several times because I was intrigued by this phenomenon, and I kind of saw that the differences are not extremely big. And in fact, when you look at mortality, sometimes in some places the differences are the opposite. So I think that there are so many things that are at play here that we just don't know about the olfactory part of it. It's a good place to stop because I don't know is the beginning for asking questions, and that's the next months of
Alex, do you agree?
Yeah, I think those are very, you know, while we understand something or beginning to understand about, you know, molecular mechanisms of viral entry and replication and inflammatory responses, I think our knowledge is very limited when it comes to sort of, you know, demographic differences and men, women, and I think children, very interesting and not quite there yet.
Great. So, Chris, do you want to say any final words, and then I'll do a quick wrap up?
Sure. I mean, one final thought I had, and the science of this is, especially for healthcare workers and people that are particularly vulnerable, you know, we have lots of things that glow when they recognize a virus or they recognize a particle. Could there be something like a nose spray that gives off light or gives off some kind of indicator? So for people at high risk, so that they know whether or not they've been hit. That feels like something that's not far from the bench that could be really useful. It's neat that came out of your ruminations. And yeah, the only other thing I want to make sure to say is thanks very much for doing this. It's exciting to get to have these conversations especially when it's got the urgency that this one does. Yeah. So we really appreciate it.
Light and truth, sounds like. So yeah, so reiterating Chris's thanks, Gilad and Alex, thank you for doing this, our first session, and thanks Chris for moderating, and of course to the audience for your really thought-provoking questions. It actually made it hugely fun and kept everyone in the hot seat, which is adds that little element of anxiety, not knowing what the questions will be and not knowing if you can actually answer them. Perfect, wonderful. You know, I just wanted to end with just a few comments, and just to reiterate that, you know, biology just is incredible, and that path of discovery and what we are able to, find in our labs every day is just amazing. And I think that this was really a great way to emphasize the unexpected that we, if you go into research with your eyes open, you can see that and not always predict it. But I think a great example of the importance of scientific research and, you know, power to data-based policies for a better world. Next week, actually, at the same time, the same day, there's a continuation of this series in conversation with Stefan McDonough, who's class of 90, who's also the executive director of genetics at Pfizer World R&D. And the title of that conversation is How Rule Breaking and innovation feed new knowledge. So tune in if you enjoyed this. We certainly did. Thanks for participating and making this a great Carney conversation. Bye.